Okay, well, everyone, thank you for joining us tonight. And tonight we are going to be looking at the Day of Atonement and then some of the morality commands for the people of Israel. And so in the first half of Leviticus, we focused a lot on preparation for the priests, handling impurity through the body. And then this week, the middle the middle part of Leviticus really does focus on the Day of Atonement, which is about the forgiveness of the sins of the people that are intentional or sins that they're unaware of. That is once a year celebration. It's the holiest day of the whole year, and it's kind of like a reset kind of day. And so we're going to look at that, and then after that, we get into the morality piece. Like, what are the people? How are the people of Israel called to live to maintain that purity through their day-to-day activity? And so this is kind of the Day of Atonement is kind of a hinge to the whole book. And so, so that's part of the reason why it's in the middle here. We can see, like, we've talked about chiasmic writing, where you have a B, C, B, A, kind of in and out kind of structure. Even the whole book of Leviticus has a bit of a chiasm structure, with the C part being that Day of Atonement. So the issue here with the book of Leviticus that we want to make sure we're clear on is that impurity is something that needs to be handled properly. And so the people of Israel, as they are going about their day-to-day life, they need to make sure that they are doing what they can to maintain purity, because God himself, his glory, is dwelling among them. And so purity becomes even more important. And one of the things that we can read through Leviticus and we're like, man, this is so many rules. But we also need to keep in mind, and I've said this before, that these rules, these laws and commandments are a gift of grace to the people, because God is telling them exactly what to do and how to maintain this purity. And so he is making a way for them to be kept close, because he's the king of the universe. And so one of the things, like if you consider like the kingdoms in the ancient world, like bringing anything defiling into a king's house would be a great offense. And so here the Lord is saying, like, anything defiling would be an offense to the Lord God. And so how do you maintain that purity is important. And so the Day of Atonement, we get these instructions in chapter 16. And so we will jump in. Verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron, who died when they approached the Lord. The Lord said to Moses, tell your brother Aaron that he is not to come whenever he chooses into the most holy place behind the curtain in front of the atonement cover on the ark, or else he will die. For I will appear in the cloud over the atonement cover. This is how Aaron is to enter the most holy place. He must first bring a young bull for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He is to put on the sacred linen tunic with linen undergarments next to his body. He is to tie the linen sash around him and put on the linen turban. These are sacred garments. So he must bathe himself with water before he puts them on. From the Israelite community, he is to take up 2 male goats for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. Aaron is to offer the bull for his own sin offering to make atonement for himself and his household. Then he is to take the 2 goats and present them before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting. He is to cast lots for the 2 goats. 1 lot for the Lord and the other for the scapegoat. Aaron shall bring the goat whose lot falls to the Lord and sacrifice it for a sin offering, but the goat chosen by Lot as the scapegoat shall be presented alive before the Lord to be used for making atonement by sending it into the wilderness as a scapegoat. All right, so a few weeks ago, we read about Nadab and Abihu and how they, as the tabernacle was being commissioned, right away, they went into the holy place with their censers burning incense, and they were immediately struck down. There's some different reasons for maybe why they thought people think they were struck down. The text doesn't tell us exactly why, but could be drunkenness, could be carelessness. Regardless, they were not following the orders of the Lord. And so here, God gives even more specific instructions for when the priest is allowed to enter the most holy place. And so it's not whenever they want. The high priest can only enter on the one day a year, the Day of Atonement is what it is called. And so the priest, the high priest, in this case Aaron, needs to prepare himself to do this. And then also his sacrifices are a part of this as well. And so the first thing that the priest does is he takes off all of his royal garments, like the ephod and the sash and all of the fanciest stuff, and he puts on the priestly tunic and the priestly turban, which all the priests would have worn. And this is kind of a humbling act for the priest, the high priest, to recognize that he is one of the priests. And so he too needs to make atonement for himself and his household. And so he has offering that he brings for his household, which is the bull. And a bull is a very expensive, valuable animal. And so that is the offering for the priest and the priest's household. And so we'll get a little instruction on what to do there. But this is the purification offering for their family. And something to remember as we think about Jesus as our perfect high priest, as the book of Hebrews tells us, is that he went, we're told that our high priest is able to enter into the Holy of Holies without the blood of goats or bulls, and to be able to do this on his own as the offering. And so this is one more example, like we should be keeping those kinds of things in mind as we're reading these passages, like how has Jesus fulfilled this? And so that's, Jesus doesn't need to make atonement or purification offerings for himself. And then, so he will offer up the goats for him and his household. And then he takes these two other goats, and one is offered as a purification offering for the people. And so it's slaughtered and burnt on the altar. And then the other one is a scapegoat. And the scapegoat is an interesting notion, because the word that we translate for scapegoat is azazel. And so there are people who think about that, are looking at that word as with a couple different possible translations. One is like as a kind of like almost spiritual leader of the wilderness, like offer it to the wilderness. But it is, it's not in any way kind of making an offering to this wilderness being. It is saying like, take all of the sins out of here. And so that's one way to look at it. The other is just like looking at the words that make up azazel, like the Hebrew root words, and it's just like the goat that leaves is essentially one way you can look at it as well. And so there are some different translations around that that are important to note, but the most scholars are going to just reject that like wilderness demon idea, and more just like this is the animal that needs to be cut off. A couple weeks ago, we looked at purification offerings with birds, and how the birds are dipped in the water and then they fly. They're sent out to take the purification or the impurity away from that household or that person. And so this is kind of like the same thing, except in a bird, it's a goat. And so the goats are determined by lots. So it could have been the Urim and the Thummim that the priest will cast lots for. And one of the reasons why casting lots would be important is because it is giving God one more chance to choose which goat he will accept. And so, so the two goats are chosen, one will go out. So let's talk about like, what do they do in the offering is the next section. Aaron shall bring the bull for his own sin offering to make atonement for himself and his household, and he is to slaughter the bull for his own sin offering. He is to take a censer full of burning coals on the altar before the Lord, and 2 handfuls of finely ground fragrant incense, and take them behind the curtains. He is to put the incense on the fire before the Lord, and the smoke of the incense will conceal the atonement cover above the tablets of the covenant law, so that he will not die. He is to take some of the bull's blood with his finger, sprinkle it on the front of the atonement cover. Then he shall sprinkle some of it with his finger 7 times before the atonement cover. And so the first thing he does is he slaughters a bull. He fills the room, the most holy place, with the smoke of the incense. And why he might do that is because it could be covering the glory of the Lord, so that the priest won't die. And then he sprinkles the blood on the different elements here. And sprinkling the blood is part of the purification process. And so blood sprinkling on things, making things pure, is kind of contrary to how we might think purification happens. But as we will see, the life is in the blood. And so this is an act that is saying, like, this bull's life has been given to purify the household of the priests. And so he does that in the house, in the tabernacle. He shall then slaughter the goat for the sin offering for the people and take its blood behind the curtain and do with it as he did with the bull's blood. He shall sprinkle it on the atonement cover and in front of it. In this way, he will make atonement for the most holy place because of the uncleanness and rebellion of the Israelites, whatever their sins have been. He is to do the same for the tent of meeting, which is among them in the midst of their uncleanness. No one is to be in the tent of meeting from the time Aaron goes in to make atonement in the most holy place until he comes out, having made atonement for himself, his household, and the whole community of Israel. And so he does the same thing with the blood of the goat, but also then he sprinkles it on the sprinkling of the blood on the tent itself, to make purification for the whole community. He shall come out of the altar that is before the Lord and make atonement for it. He shall take some of the bull's blood and some of the goat's blood and put it on all the horns of the altar. He shall sprinkle some of the blood on it with his finger 7 times to cleanse it and to consecrate it from the uncleanness of the Israelites. And so again, here, this sprinkling of blood is all about purification. And so now he's gone into the most holy place, purified the elements of the Ark of the Covenant, and then he goes and sprinkles on the tent, and then he goes outside to the altar, which is a place where the sin offerings, the purification offerings are being burnt all the time. And so this is one more time where he is taking a moment to pause from the rest of the regular worship and sacrificial system to purify the elements that they use for sacrifices. And these sins that the people are, like the impurities of the people, again, it's not necessarily something that they knew they were doing. It could have been an accident. It's just one more way to help them see that sin leads to death, and these animals are taking their place. They're substitutes for the people. Verse 20, when Aaron has finished making atonement for the most holy place, the tent of meeting, and the altar, he shall bring forward the live goat. He is to lay both hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the wickedness and rebellion of the Israelites, all their sins, and put them on the goat's head. He shall send the goat away into the wilderness in the care of someone appointed for the task. The goat will carry on itself all their sins to a remote place, and the man shall release it in the wilderness. Then Aaron is to go into the tent of meeting and take off the linen garments he put on before he entered the most holy place, and he is to leave them there. He shall bathe himself with water in the sanctuary area and put on his regular garments. Then he shall come out and sacrifice the burnt offering for himself and the burnt offering for the people, to make atonement for himself and for the people. He shall also burn the fat of the sin offering on the altar. The man who releases the goat as a scapegoat must wash his clothes and bathe himself with the water. Afterwards, he may come into the camp. The bull and the goat for the sin offerings, whose blood was brought into the most holy place to make atonement, must be taken outside the camp. Their hides, flesh, and intestines are to be burned up. The man who burns them must wash his clothes and bathe himself with water. Afterward, he may come into the camp. So all of this has been done. Like what the priest has been doing, high priest has been doing, is in the regular priest's clothes, And so once all this blood sprinkling and the laying on of hands on the scapegoat, all of that is done, he changes and does the burnt offerings. But that scapegoat piece is very important, because what the priest is doing is transferring these sins onto the goat. And, laying hands on something doesn't just do that. And so it's a symbolic act to say, Lord, we know we are imperfect, and we thank you that you remove our sin from us. And so that's what the scapegoat is doing, is removing the people's sins from the camp. And so the person would lead it out into the wilderness, quite a ways, and hopefully the goat wouldn't come back. But as they went out there, the goat was on its own, and it was basically in the Lord's hands as they sent it out into the wilderness. And then after all those things are happening, the priest finally burns the animal, the goat, or the bull and the goat, on the altar. Any excess blood from the animal is brought outside of the camp to the unclean place, but every part of the animal is burnt, then washed. The person doing the burning washes and cleans themselves. The person who led the scapegoat out comes back. They have to wash, change their clothes, wash, all that stuff, and then they can come back in to the camp. And so this, as you think about like the alignment of the tabernacle, the entryway is heading east. And anytime we think about like the orientation of the people of Israel, east is the bad place. It's like where like the fall happened. It's where the Tower of Babel happened. All of these things happened to the east, and so they are taking those things back to where they come from, essentially. And so here they're taking them out of the entryway of the tabernacle to a solitary place, and most likely they just would go east and take it away from the most holy place. Let's pick up in verse 29. This is to be a lasting ordinance for you. On the 10th day of the 7th month, you must deny yourselves and not do any work, whether native born or foreigner residing among you, because on this day atonement will be made for you to cleanse you. Then before the Lord, you will be clean from all your sins. It is the day of Sabbath rest, and you must deny yourselves. It is a lasting ordinance. The priest who is anointed and ordained to succeed his father as high priest is to make atonement. He is to put on the sacred linen garments and make atonement for the most holy place, for the tent of meeting and the altar, and for the priests and all the members of the community. This is to be a lasting ordinance for you. Atonement is to be made once a year for all the sins of the Israelites. And it was done as the Lord commanded Moses. So this is something that happens in usually September every year. For us, it would be September. And so it's a lasting ordinance. And so people still observe the Day of Atonement, but they are not necessarily doing all of the sacrifices and all of the stuff because they don't have a tabernacle. They don't have the altars. They don't have the most holy place. Like they are not doing that part of it, but they still, even now, are making it a day, the Jewish people make it a day of fasting, of not working, to seek the Lord's atonement for themselves. And so, so they're humbling themselves, denying themselves, fasting. And it's not just the people of Israel. Anybody who lives in the community must also follow this day. And that this is all part of that, that purification process. Purification is so crucial for the people to host the presence of God among them in the tabernacle, or to recognize that God is trying to host them in his presence, but they need to be pure to enter in. So that's the Day of Atonement. And it's just a few verses talking about this day, but it becomes one of the most holy days of the whole year for the people of Israel. Chapter 17 then opens up talking more about consuming blood and how do they handle butchering animals and all these different things, recognizing that they just talked about the value of the bull and the goat and the handling all these sacrifices properly. And so now they're going to get into like, what do we do every day? How do we prepare food every day? And so let's jump to 17 verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, speak to Aaron and his sons and to all the Israelites and say to them, this is what the Lord has commanded. Any Israelite who sacrifices an ox, a lamb, or a goat in the camp or outside of it, instead of bringing it to the entrance of the tent of meeting, is to present it as an offering to the Lord in front of the tabernacle of the Lord. That person shall be considered guilty if they sacrifice the animal outside of the camp. Bloodshed. They have shed blood and must be cut off from their people. This is so the Israelites will bring to the Lord the sacrifices they are now making in the open fields. They must bring them to the priest, that is, to the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and sacrifice them as a fellowship offering. The priest is to splash the blood against the altar of the Lord and the entrance to the tent of meeting, and burn the fat as an aroma pleasing to the Lord. They must no longer offer any of their sacrifices to the goat idols to whom they prostitute themselves. This is to be a lasting ordinance for them and for the generations to come. And so the people of Israel are coming out of Egypt, right? And so there was all kinds of pagan idolatry in Egypt. And so they probably picked up some of those habits. And so the Lord now is saying, like, any time you are making a sacrifice, you have to do it at the tabernacle. You cannot go just out into the field and make a sacrifice. And so this, in ensuring that these sacrifices are happening at the tabernacle, helps to make sure that the people are not offering things up to the goat idols that are mentioned here. And who those goat idols are, like, we don't get a whole lot of detail. It's like God knows that people are doing this, and he said they have to stop. They have to stop engaging in idolatry. And so this led to really, like, anytime somebody butchered an animal, it was bring it to the tabernacle to make sure that they are not sacrificing to the goat idol, because any animal that was sacrificed to a goat idol, the Lord is saying you're guilty of bloodshed. Essentially, you're a murderer. So it's not just that you are idolatrous, you are also guilty of murder. And so the people are, there's strong evidence that they were, anytime they wanted to slaughter an animal, they brought it to the tabernacle. And so this is part of one of the tension points for the people of Israel and for like modern scholars about Israel, is when did Israel become monotheistic? Because the nation emerged out of a polytheistic culture with all kinds of different gods and idols all over the place. And so when did they end up becoming monotheistic and serving Yahweh as the centerpiece of their existence? And so here we have evidence that this is a transition moment for the people of Israel. But also, like, we see, like, idolatry is a major problem throughout the history of the people of Israel. When we read the Hebrew scriptures, they were constantly ignoring this principle as they entered into the land. And so this is important to note, that God is against idolatry of any form. So even early on, stop worshiping these goat idols. Let's pick up verse 8. Say to them, any Israelite or any foreigner residing among them who offers a burnt offering or sacrifice and does not bring it to the entrance to the tent of meeting to sacrifice it to the Lord must be cut off from the people of Israel. I will set my face against any Israelite or foreigner residing among them who eats blood, and I will cut them off from the people. For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. Therefore, I say to the Israelites, none of you may eat blood, nor may any foreigner residing among you eat blood. And so they bring all of the sacrifice to the tabernacle. Don't eat the blood. And this is one more way where the Lord would help the people to make sure that they didn't eat the blood, because the priest is right there saying, don't eat that. Don't eat the blood. And in different cultures, consuming the blood of an animal was a way to, like, take on their powers, take on their characteristics. Some cultures, it was a potential, like, fertility worship, that kind of thing. And so the Lord is emphasizing here again, like, don't do this. I will set my face against anybody. And this is a strong phrasing of saying, basically, I am against you if you do this. You are becoming an enemy of the Lord if you eat the blood. And it's so important because the life is in the blood, and all of the life, like, God is the author of life. And so just trying to take what is the Lord's for yourself is not something that the people of Israel are supposed to be doing. And so anytime of any use of blood in the worship system is all about atonement, not about absorption of animal forces. And so so we already know, like, all the animals that are clean or unclean that are able to be sacrificed or consumed. And so the safest bet is to slaughter animals at the tabernacle, and then offer it as a fellowship offering, and to be a part of this worship of the Lord, and to make sure that they are not falling into the ways of their neighbors, because the people of Israel are called to live distinct. And so even if there are foreigners among you that are consuming blood, the people of Israel, like, need to put a stop to that, because that is one of the ways that you bring impurity into the camp, into the community. Verse 13, any Israelite or foreigner residing among you who hunts any animal or bird that may be eaten must drain out the blood and cover it with the earth, because the life of every creature is its blood. That is why I have said to the Israelites, you must not eat the blood of any creature, because the life of every creature is its blood. Anyone who eats must be cut off. Anyone, whether native born or foreigner, who eats anything found dead or torn by wild animals must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be ceremonially unclean till evening. Then they will be clean. But if they do not wash their clothes and bathe themselves, they will be held responsible. And so any animal that is hunted outside of the community, and then can, like, slaughtered, they can't just, like, collect the blood and keep it. They need to bury it, put it back into the earth. And so that is, one of the ways to make sure that they don't consume it is to just bury it. Another interesting and gross thing here that we see is, like, if they find a dead animal, or something that was torn, they're not told they can't eat it, but if they do, they have to wash their clothes and themselves, and then be made clean once sun sets. And so they're dealing with death and the shedding of blood and all these different things, and so they are impure if they don't follow these commands. And so that's looking at how to handle blood, and then it goes on to chapter 18, which is all about purity in human sexual relationships, and any kind of sexual relationship. And these are this and chapter 20 are going to both talk about sexuality in the Jewish community. And when we look at pure and impure, and one of the key elements is that the Lord sets up boundaries for his people. And so the world around the people of Israel is living differently in a lot of different cases, but the people of Israel are called to live pure. And so a lot of what we're looking at is family relationships. A lot of what we're looking at with these taboos around sexuality are also focused on protecting the vulnerable, and protecting family dynamics. And so there's a lot of laws that we're going to read through, and some of them are like, oh yeah, of course, why would you need a law for this? But we know people, if you don't sometimes tell people the law, they'll do what they want until someone tells them to stop. And so the Lord is giving them all the laws for his community. And like this law, like sexual morality and human sexuality is something that is a major issue in our culture today. And one of the carryovers from the law that the Lord gives to the Gentile believers in Acts 15, one of the carryovers is avoid sexual immorality. And so a list like this is part of how you would form that sexual ethic in the community. So let's jump in. Verse 18, the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You must not do as they do in Egypt, where you used to live, and must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you. Do not follow their practices. You must obey my laws and be careful to follow my decrees. I am the Lord your God. Keep my decrees and laws, for the person who obeys them will live by them. I am the Lord. And so one of the key elements as we talk about God's law is he is creating a path of life. The law is designed for human flourishing. And so he is saying, be different from where you came from or to where you're going, be different, follow the Lord. Verse 6, no one is to approach any close relative to have sexual relations. I am the Lord. Do not dishonor your father by having sexual relations with your mother. She is your mother. Do not have relations with her. Do not have sexual relations with your father's wife. So that would be like your stepmom. That would dishonor your father. Do not have sexual relations with your sister, either your father's daughter or your mother's daughter, whether she was born in the same home or elsewhere. So that would be your biological sister or a half-sister or a stepsister. Do not have sexual relations with your son's daughter or your daughter's daughter. That would dishonor you. Do not have sexual relations with your daughter of your father's wife born to your father. She is your sister. Do not have sexual relations with your father's sister. She is your father's close relative. Do not have sexual relations with your mother's sister, because she is your mother's close relative. Do not dishonor your father's brother by approaching his wife to have sexual relations. She is your aunt. Do not have sexual relations with your daughter-in-law. She is your son's wife. Do not have relations with her. Do not have sexual relations with your brother's wife. That would dishonor your brother. Do not have sexual relations with both a woman and her daughter. Do not have sexual relations with either her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter. They are her close relatives. That is wickedness. Do not take your wife's sister as a rival and have sexual relations with her while your wife is living. Do not approach a woman to have sexual relations during the uncleanness of her monthly period. Do not have sexual relations with your neighbor's wife and defile yourself with her. Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, for you must not profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That is detestable. Do not have sexual relations with an animal and defile yourself with it. A woman must not present herself to an animal to have sexual relations with it. That is a perversion. And so all of these laws are, remember, about purity within the community. And so looking at the family dynamics all throughout here is like, these are close relatives. Do not abuse the family. Do not cross these boundaries, because we need to protect and protect the sanctity of the family and not complicate these relationships in any way. And so there were cultures that did not follow all these laws. There are some cultures that had sexual ethics similar to the people of Israel, but others that did not. And a major part of this is the idolatry and pagan worship practices that would have been a part of the sexual ethic of those cultures. And so looking at the issues like homosexuality is listed in here, and that is a part of, in the ancient world, that would have been something that could have been a part of idolatrous practice, but also just as there were some cultures where older men would take on younger men and groom them in a way to fulfill their own perverse desires. And so the Lord is saying all of this is wrong, all of this. And so when we look at these kinds of commands from the Lord about sexuality, we need to not put our culture's frame of reference on how we as followers of the Lord should carry out human sexuality. We are called to live different. And so the church, and this is one of the hard things that's happening in our culture right now, is there's all kinds of churches and debates that are going on around human sexuality, and churches that are compromising for the culture's sake, instead of saying like, well, what is God calling us to do? How does God call us to live, even though the world around us is saying it's all totally fine? And, and so I'm not saying, I don't want you to I want us to be careful. There's incest in this list. Don't do that. And a lot of people are like, yeah, of course, incest's wrong. But in the same list is issues of homosexuality. And, we need to be careful not to just take that one thing out of this list and say, well, that's different for today. Well, all these other things, yeah, don't have sex with animals. Okay, no problem. Don't sleep with your stepmom. Yeah, that's good. But there's a reason this is all, the issue of homosexuality is also in here. We also have people talk about polygamy in the Bible and how people are, and there's people with multiple wives throughout the Bible. And the verse that says, do not take your wife's sister as a rival wife and have sexual relations with your wife while she is living. The translation there is interesting, because it is not just that you should not take your wife's sister as a second rival wife, but the verse is, do not take a woman in addition to her sister, or to take a woman, like a second wife. And so this is one of the areas where, like, if your wife is still alive, you're still married to this woman, don't take another, is kind of the principle. And so there are commands against polygamy, even in the Old Testament. And so sometimes people see those polygamous relationships in the Old Testament and misunderstand, like saying, oh, God's fine with this. And it's like, well, no, God's not fine with this. Throughout the Old Testament, anytime we see a polygamous relationship, it never ends well, never. So let's keep going. Verse 24, do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I'm going to drive out before you became defiled. Even the land was defiled. So I punished it for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you must keep my decrees and my laws. The native born and the foreigners residing among you must not do any of these detestable things, for all these things were done by the people who lived in the land before you, and the land became defiled. And if you defile the land, it will vomit you out as it vomited out the nations that were before you. Everyone who does any of these detestable things, such persons must be cut off from the people. Keep my requirements and do not follow any of the detestable customs that were practiced before you came, and do not defile yourselves with them. I am the Lord your God. And so God is saying here, like, I'm driving out these nations because of their defilement. And so, one of the issues that we'll have to, get into when we start reading through Joshua and the conquest is that there are people already there. And so people read that and say, this is a form of genocide. And it's hard for us to read because, the people of Jericho were wiped out. That's hard to, like, it's not what any of us want to read. We don't want that. But the Lord is saying here, like, they have so perverted themselves in all of these different sexual practices and their sexual ethic that they cannot, their defilement is so severe that they must be driven out. And so it is, I can't make excuses for it, but it is important to recognize that the Lord isn't just like saying, like, well, these people are in the way. He's like, no, their wickedness is beyond redemption at this point. They have defiled themselves too far. Now, the Lord will also, he says, if you do these things, the land will vomit you out. I will drive you out. And the Lord does that to his own people. He sends them into exile. And so, like, to keep in mind that the Lord is not just being capricious about anybody, but his own people need to live up to his standards as well. And so as we think through these different issues, like, we have to recognize that the Lord is the one who sets the standards, not us, not the culture. Let's go chapter 19, because there is more of this morality code that we're following. The Lord said to Moses, speak to the entire assembly of Israel and say to them, be holy, because I, the Lord, your God, am holy. Jesus picks this out in his own ministry in Mark 12:28. to recognize that the Lord is holy, be holy as I am holy. And also in this chapter that we're going to get into is one of the most important verses that we will read in, and Jesus will say, this is the second greatest commandment, love your neighbor as you love yourself. This is going to be all part of this morality code. And it really does sum up, like, what is this morality code about? It is about loving your neighbor as you love yourself. Verse 3, each one of you must respect your mother and father, and you must observe my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. That, as a household, like, honor your parents for sure. And the rhythms of the Sabbath are a part of the family rhythms as well, for the people of Israel. And so, like, those are closely connected. Do not turn to idols or make metal gods for yourselves. I am the Lord your God. When you sacrifice a fellowship offering to the Lord, sacrifice it in such a way that it will be accepted on your behalf. It shall be eaten on the day you sacrifice it, or the next day. Anything left over until the third day must be burned up. If any of it is eaten on the third day, it is impure and will not be accepted. Whoever eats it will be held responsible because they have desecrated what is holy to the Lord. They must be cut off from their people. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather gleanings in your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. And so, we already read about when to eat the fellowship offering and, like, the third day, whatever you don't eat by the third day, burn it all up. But then it gets this, like, verse about not going all the way to the edges of your property. We're starting to see part of the social safety net that the Lord put into the principles for his people. There were the poor, the widow, the orphan, the foreigner among you. These were vulnerable, marginalized people groups in Israel, and the Lord wants to provide for them as well. And so they were not supposed to take up all of the stuff, all of the grapes, all of the harvest, but to leave some for the poor. And we will see this come into play when we get to Ruth. She starts gleaning from Boaz's fields, and that's how she meets Boaz, and that's how she gets married, and then her grandson is King David. Spoiler alert. Verse 11, do not steal, do not lie, do not deceive one another, do not swear falsely by my name and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Do not defraud or rob your neighbor. Do not hold back the wages of a hired worker overnight. Do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, but fear your God. I am the Lord. Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. Do not go about spreading slander among your people. Do not do anything that endangers your neighbor's life. I am the Lord. Do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly so that you will not share in their guilt. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Keep my decrees. Do not make different kinds of animals. Do not plant your fields with different kinds of seed. Do not wear clothing woven of two kinds of material. And so here we have some of the things that are, like, echoes out from the 10 Commandments. We start to see, like, case law, things that are getting more clarity or better understanding. Part of the key issue here is to do justice, and to not look at anybody with favoritism, but to treat everyone fairly. Also looking at, telling the truth, not seeking revenge. Don't, watch out for your neighbor's life. One of the things that is still surprising to me is how many people in churches who around the country who just don't care about the health of others. And we're all over it with COVID, right? We're all over it. We're so ready to move on, but, like, it is still important for us to care about other people and their health, and to not put them in danger. And so these are all parts of God's commands. And then also, do not wear clothing woven of two kinds of material. And, some people look at that like, you can't wear polyester, you can't wear a poly blend. And, there was one person who could wear garments of different kinds of material, and that was the priest. Their sash and their tunic, and there were different fabrics woven together And so it could be like with that weird command, just it seems like thrown in here, just to remind the people, like, this is a holy garment that only the priest wears. And it's not for every day. It's not for everybody. And so boundaries are a part of what the Lord is putting into place. And because boundaries help the people maintain their purity. And so even things like mixing the garments is like you're crossing a boundary. And so we need to be careful of those different boundaries. Verse 20, if a man sleeps with a female slave who is promised to another man, but who has not been ransomed or given her freedom, there must be due punishment, yet they are not to be put to death because she has not been freed. The man, however, must bring a ram to the entrance of the tent of meeting for a guilt offering to the Lord. With the ram of the guilt offering, the priest is to make atonement for him before the Lord for the sin he has committed, and his sin will be forgiven. And so this is a weird little law. I mean, we want our modern sensibilities, like we would like slavery to not be a thing. And the Lord would just say, set everybody free. But we also see here people who are living in a broken community, like slavery is still a thing. And a lot of what is in the Hebrew mindset of slavery is like indentured servitude. And so this could be a woman who is paying off a debt. And so she may be pledged to another person, but they haven't paid the dowry as a ransom to set her free. And so here this is actually a protection for the servant to say, like, if you do this, there are consequences. You can't just sleep with somebody because they're a slave. You can't just take advantage of the vulnerable. There are consequences for your actions. And so here the Lord is giving those consequences. Verse 23, when you enter the land and plant any kind of fruit tree, regard its fruit as forbidden. For 3 years, you are to consider it forbidden. It must not be eaten. In the 4th year, all the fruit will be holy, an offering of praise to the Lord. But in the 5th year, you may eat its fruit. In this way, the harvest will be increased. I am the Lord your God. Do not eat any meat with the blood still in it. Do not practice divination or seek omens. Do not cut the hair at the sides of your head or clip off the edges of your beard. Do not cut your bodies for the dead or put tattoo marks on yourselves. I am the Lord. Do not degrade your daughters by making her a prostitute, or the land will turn to prostitution and be filled with wickedness. Observe my Sabbaths and have reverence for my sanctuary. I am the Lord. Do not turn to mediums or seek out spiritists, for you will be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. Stand up. Okay, let's pause there. Most of these commands are tied to pagan idolatry, divination, worship of the dead, and those kinds of things. And so even like trimming the corners of your beard, cutting yourself, tattoo marks, all of these things were part of pagan practices. And so the Lord is saying, don't do that. Like, just don't worship these other things. Even the prostitution, turning your daughter to a prostitute, there were cultures that had shrine prostitutes. And so again, the sexual ethic of the Lord is that sex is a gift, and it's for human flourishing. It is not something where you're trying to manipulate the spiritual world to get your way. And so that's often what the shrine prostitution was really all about, was trying to get the Lord or the deity that was being worshipped, the demon, the false god, whatever, get that force, that spirit to do something for you. And so the Lord is saying, don't do those things. And then also don't turn to mediums or seek out spiritists. All of those different things are a part of trying to gain control of the spiritual world that the people of God are not supposed to be a part of. Do not stand up in the presence of the aged. Show respect for the elderly and revere your God. I am the Lord. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself. For you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Do not use dishonest standards when measuring length, weight, or quantity. Use honest scales and honest weights and honest ephah and an honest hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Keep all my decrees and all my laws and follow them. I am the Lord. And so here we have, more commands about social issues and being just and fair, and even like paying attention and honoring the elderly for the people. It's all part of this process of honoring the elders, honoring God, and trusting that He sees even what you don't see, and how we treat the marginalized. Looking at earlier, I kind of jumped past it because I was going to get to this part, but earlier it said, don't put a stumbling block in front of the blind or curse the deaf. Like, they can't see your stumbling blocks, they can't hear your curses, but the Lord sees and the Lord hears. And so this is one of those things, like all of these different issues, like, is keeping in mind that we, the people of God, serve a power greater than ourselves. And we may think we may be getting away with something, but what the Lord is saying here is that, no, you are not getting away with something. I see what you are doing. And so as a way to honor God, we should just love our neighbor as we love ourselves. Even the foreign people among you, love them as you love yourselves. Why? The Lord says here, because you were once foreigners in Egypt. And so even as we look jumping into like our modern debates around immigration and all these different things, like refugees, all this different stuff, like one of the things we should keep in mind is like the people of Israel were refugees. Many of our families left their home countries and came here out of desperation. And so we should extend a grace to people who are desperate and look for ways to help, not just to perpetuate injustices or to excuse injustices that they may have done, but to say, like, there are people that need help and we should be willing to find ways to help. But this is not always the easy path. But we must remember that the Lord is our God. All right, chapter 20 is going to repeat a lot of what we have already kind of talked about, but it's going to start looking at like punishments. And one of the punishments that we see over and over is he will be cut off, which is like separated from the people. And so we have to keep that in mind. So chapter 20, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, any Israelite or foreigner residing in Israel who sacrifices any of his children to Molech is to be put to death. And so Molech was a false god. Human sacrifice was a part of the worship of Molech. And the Lord is saying that is death. That's it. The members of the community are to stone him. And so this stoning is a community taking responsibility to make this justice happen. I myself will set my face against him and will cut him off from his people. For by sacrificing his children to Molech, he has defiled my sanctuary and profaned my holy name. If the members of the community close their eyes when that man sacrifices one of his children to Molech, so tried to ignore him, and they fail to put him to death, I myself will set my face against him and his family and will cut them off from their people, together with all who follow him in prostituting themselves to Molech. I will set my face against anyone who turns to mediums or spiritists to prostitute themselves by following them, and I'll cut them off from the people. Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am the Lord your God. Keep my decrees and follow them. I am the Lord who makes you holy. It goes on. Anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death, because they have cursed their father or mother. Their blood will be on their own head. And that cursing father and mother is not just like disagreeing or like teenage rebellion. It's like saying, like, I reject you, mother and father. And so when Jesus is talking to the religious leaders and he says, like, you are taking what would have been an honor to your parents and saying it's for the temple. He's kind of echoing back to this verse, like, you are dishonoring your parents, and according to the law, you should be stoned, but you're not really quick to do that. If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress are to be put to death. If a man has sexual relations with his father's wife, he has dishonored his father. Both the man and the woman are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. If a man has sexual relations with his daughter-in-law, both of them are to be put to death. What they have done is a perversion. Their blood will be on their own heads. If a man has sexual relations with a man, as one does with a woman, both of them have done what is detestable. They are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. If a man marries both a woman and her mother, it is wicked. Both he and they must be burned in the fire, so that no wickedness will be among you. If a man has sexual relations with an animal, he is to be put to death, and you must kill the animal. If a woman approaches an animal that have sexual relations with it, kill both the woman and the animal. They are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. If a man marries his sister, the daughter of either his father or his mother, and they have sexual relations, it is a disgrace. They are to be publicly removed from their people. He has dishonored his sister and will be held responsible. If a man has sexual relations with a woman during her monthly period, he has exposed the source of her flow, and she also has uncovered it. Both of them are to be cut off from their people. Do not have sexual relations with the sister of either your mother or your father, for that would dishonor a close relative. Both of you would be held responsible. If a man has sexual relations with his aunt, he has dishonored his uncle. They will be held responsible. They will die childless. If a man marries his brother's wife, it is an act of impurity. He has dishonored his brother. They will be childless. And so here we see the consequences for these sexual perversions in the Old Testament, in the covenant people of Israel. And these are not easy. These are challenging to us, like all of these, like our death. But the key here, again, is for the Lord, he's trying to maintain purity in the community of faith. And people are breaking the boundaries, bringing impurity into the covenant community. And so there are consequences for this impurity, but partly as well, this impurity has a way of spreading. And so the Lord is saying, like, we take these things seriously. The consequences are deadly. And so this is on par with any kind of idolatrous worship and divination and practice of those different things as well. And so it's not that the Lord is singling out sexual immorality for these capital punishments, but he's singling out the things that lead to and cause the great spread of impurity in the covenant community. So verse 22, keep all my decrees and laws and follow them, so that the land where I am bringing you to live may not vomit you out. You must not live according to the customs of the nations I am going to drive out before you, because they did all these things. I abhorred them. But I said to you, you will possess their land. I will give it to you as an inheritance, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, who has set you apart from the nations. You must therefore make a distinction between clean and unclean animals, and between unclean and clean birds. Do not defile yourself by any animal or bird, anything that moves along the ground. Those that I have set apart as unclean for you, you are to be holy to me, because I, the Lord, am holy. And I have set you apart from the nations to be my own. A man or woman who is a medium or spiritist among you must be put to death. You are to stone them. Their blood will be on their own heads. All right. And so all of these different commands comes back to the simple desire of the Lord, that his people will be holy, set apart, that they will be distinct, just as he himself is distinct. He is holy. And so his holiness should motivate their purity in their everyday practice of life. And as you read through the history of the people of Israel, they don't always succeed at this. They don't always do a great job, but these sins must be addressed. And throughout the Bible, sin is a very serious matter. It leads to death. That is why the animal is sacrificed. That animal for the sin offering, the guilt offering, is taking the place of the person. That is the final substitute. That is the substitute for them. And on the Day of Atonement, all these sins there may be things that they didn't know they did. The Day of Atonement is a day to say, like, we know we are imperfect. We know that our impurities are things that we are called to make right. And so the Day of Atonement is a day where they would remember their need to be cleansed. And so this is a part of that as well. So the sanctity of life and relationships, that's the goal of these commands. to preserve life, to preserve healthy relationships, to preserve the boundaries of the community, and to one commentator says surgically remove anything that is creating the impurity. So it is not like saying like we should just really go crazy with capital punishment, but instead it's saying like these capital offenses are listed as a way to, as a deterrent to try to say those things will lead to death. The Lord's plan is to lead to life. So with that, live holy because the Lord your God is holy. And as people, we know like, well, we're not good at that. We need help. And that's one of the beautiful things about the gospel. Jesus came perfectly human, perfectly God, perfectly holy, and laid his life down as a final substitute for us. And so we can trust him. And so we seek his atonement and his rescue to lead us into right relationship with the Lord. So any questions? We went over a lot of stuff, a lot of scripture, but any comments, questions, thoughts?
Do you think the commands about not taking your wife's sister as a revenge is kind of a censure of Jacob? Not that he took her as a revenge, but yeah, like that whole family dynamic is a little messed up.
Right, and so it's not revenge; it's as a rival, is what the text says. And so so any introduction to a rival wife in the people of Israel, that's a really bad idea. It's a really bad idea. And as you read through Genesis, like there's so much stuff in Genesis that is trying to help the people of Israel say, God has a plan. We tend to try to make our own plans, and then that gets messed up. And then we come back to God's plan. And so Jacob had a plan. He wanted to marry Rachel. And then his father-in-law, Laban, tricked him. And so like, it's not entirely Jacob's fault that he has multiple wives, right? Like, but it's not a good idea to have multiple wives. And so like, Jacob is such a weird, the more I think about his life, the more I'm just like, man, this nation existing at all is miracle upon miracle, because like it started with such great dysfunction. And so, but the law about rival wife, your wife's sister as a rival wife or any other rival wife, like those kinds of commands, it's like really to say, like, look back at your history, not a good idea, right? So which is like, you look at most of the laws in America, like most of the time a law is written because somebody did something stupid or bad, and then they were like, we should really specify why is this not a good idea. And so school zones are there because it would be reckless to just go as fast as you want when there's a bunch of kids around, right? That wasn't always the case. We had to make that law. So there's, go back to the history, say, well, people kept hitting kids with their cars, so maybe we need to tell them to slow down, and speeding becomes even more expensive if you're caught in a school zone, to try to deter that kind of behavior. So any other questions?
The Day of Atonement was for people who weren't killed, or did they actually do this? Did they kill a lot of people who made these mistakes?
Who's they that you're asking?
The Jews. I mean, you're supposed to be killed for
all of these capital offenses.
A lot capital offenses. Did they follow through and do that, or did, like you're saying, the Day of Atonement comes around and they can be atoned, or is that just for the people who weren't dead?
Well,
was there a path to redemption?
Well, we don't have like the execution records for the people of Israel, which we could read and say, then they didn't do it, right?
We just don't know.
Well, yeah, it's like they either didn't do it or we don't know. Maybe they kept the record and we don't have it, but we do see the Lord, like, intervening when these kinds of like this kind of immorality rises up. And why would the Lord have to intervene if this immorality was rising up? Because the people weren't doing it. We don't have any record of the Lord, like, of the people actually stoning somebody for dishonoring their parents. And when we read the history of Israel, like, there's plenty of people who are practicing all kind of idolatry, even King Solomon, and nobody was executing the king. So these commands, are grave, they're intense, but we don't really see evidence in scripture of this being carried out. And so the closest we get is in, like, of people saying, like, we're going to stone an adulterer, is in John chapter 8, when they bring the adulterous woman to Jesus. But even then, it's just the woman, it's not the man. And here in Leviticus, it's supposed to be both. And so, so they were not good at following these commands. It's something that the Hebrew scriptures, I think, is intentionally telling us, as the people were writing these things down and telling the history of the people, was like, they're not good at this. And the prophets were calling the people to repent, to turn away, because the people were not good at it. So, but we don't have So
the Day of Atonement was for anyone who was for everyone.
It would be for everyone who, it would be for everyone who either failed to make their own sacrifices, or who didn't know that they were bringing impurity into the camp. But it was not, I don't know if we could say, like, it was a annual do-over for the people for their immorality. Like, I think that when the text says they will be cut off, the Lord still sees. And so, like, there are consequences for actions that we see in the Bible. And so, but even the Day of Atonement, in the Old Testament, we don't get a lot of examples of the people carrying out the festivals. They were not always very good at these things. So we read the book of Judges. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did whatever they saw fit. And so there was a lot of just seemingly anarchy in the kingdom in the people of Israel. And the Lord would raise these judges up to help them get back on track, but then follow into the kings. And, we had some good kings who tried to bring him back, and then a run of bad kings, and then a good king would rise up, and then a run of bad kings. And so people just kept reverting back to the ways of the people of Canaan, the people that the Lord was trying to drive out. They kept coming back to those same things again and again. And so that's ultimately, like, what the exile, like, was the land will vomit you out. And so, so the Lord sees, the Lord in his time brought the judgment to the people. Does that make sense, Chris?
How does this apply to us?
Well, here's the great news. Hebrews tells us, like I said, Jesus enters into the holy place without the blood of bulls and rams. He enters in with his own blood. So for us as new covenant believers, because of what Jesus has done on our behalf, we don't have to go back into the Day of Atonement. We don't have to go back into the sacrificial system. When we place our faith in Jesus, his righteousness cleanses us of our impurity. And so when we look at then the law, we're looking at God's path of life and saying, okay, Jesus has perfectly fulfilled the law for me. And so my desire is to ask the Lord to help me to live out these principles of the law of purity, of holiness, not as if my holiness will save me, but because I want to be formed by God's design for human flourishing. So it's not that I have to go back.
It's just they apply to us because they're just good principles.
A lot of it. I mean, yeah. Like you.
Because I mean, I know that I'm not perfect and I've been cleansed by the blood of Jesus.
Right. Yeah. And so a lot of the stuff in these laws that we read, and we went through a lot of laws, but like, I would hope most of us would not say like, well, I'm going to put this stumbling block in front of this blind person because I can, because Jesus forgave my sins, right? It's like, no, that's a jerk thing to do. Like, don't do that. It's a good principle just to say like, I'm going to love my neighbor. I'm going to protect the vulnerable. I'm going to stand up for the people who are experiencing injustice. These are all the heart of the law, of these laws that we read. Like, I'm going to protect vulnerable people in my family. You know, I'm going to honor the boundaries of my family, even in the sexual ethic that is listed here. Like these are things that are like, God has designed these boundaries. I'm going to honor that and not try to just say like, Jesus forgave my sins, so I can do whatever I want. I'm still going to honor these principles, these laws, knowing that these laws aren't what saves me. It's Jesus that saves me. So, yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean,
okay.
I mean, that's what I was thinking about when I asked the question. Is like, because we are in the dispensation of grace or whatever you want to call it.
Right. Yeah.
It doesn't really apply to us.
Well, it doesn't apply to us in the same way, in that it's like, you know, if we don't do this, we'll be cut off. Like if we don't do the Day of Atonement, are we going to be cut off? No. Like we as New Covenant believers are not going to be cut off from the people of God because we don't honor the Day of Atonement, because we have the final sacrifice in Jesus already. But looking at the principle of the Day of Atonement is like, yeah, sin is real. Impurity is bad. And like, we should be asking the Lord, not just once a year, but every day, say, Lord, examine my heart, purify me, cleanse me. And that's part of the ongoing process of Christian living. So, yeah. But yeah, it's interesting. A lot of laws in the Old Testament, sometimes there's like, why would you have to write that down? Well, because somebody was not doing the right thing. So a lot of these laws, like somebody put a stumbling block in front of a blind person, and they had to be told, that's not good. Don't do that. You know, and sometimes we think, well, isn't that just common sense? But we assume things, and you know what happens when we assume. So sometimes you're right, but often the other thing. So yeah. Any other questions? No? All right. Well, next week, we will not meet next Wednesday. I'm going to have a little vacation time next week. And so we won't meet, but then we'll be back the following week. And so, yeah, so y'all have a good week. I'll see you Sunday. Most of you will see Sunday. So, all right, take it easy and have a good night.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, Jason.